of Oxford, one of the first or the first associate professor and senior research on sustainable issues in Oxford University. And his research on this area for several years covers a broad range of topics like stranded assets, transition risks, governance and climate risk, green infrastructures, climate risk and asset management, and many other topics related with sustainability. Then Ben has a broad view of many things that are happening around sustainability. Today's presentation is going to cover one aspect that is, as all of the people know, is key in the things related with sustainability, and is the use of data, and in particular the use of data from Earth observation and technology and from the space. That could be very important for several risks related with transition and physical risks to scale the green finance. This use of new technologies and new data and trying to promote the use of data is one area that is particularly important from our side. And as Bank of Spain, we are participating in, for example, in the BIS Innovation Network working group on green finance, and we are covering things related with increase of quantity of data, assess the environmental materiality of data, or foster the data for small and medium firms. And I know that some colleagues of this working groups join also to this speech. Then thanks a lot for all of them. And on top of that, we also, as you know, there are a lot of initiatives trying to use new technologies and new data in order to foster green finance. Then I think that it's a privilege to have Ben with us and to have some overview and a very privileged insight of how can we use this amount of information that could be particularly important, and that we are not used to deal with that, but that could be critical in order to help understand better the climate risk, both the transition and the physical risk, and could be very important for financial institutions in order to promote and to engage with the transition towards a more sustainable economy. No more than that. Ben, the first use, and again, many thanks for being with us from the part of Bank of Spain and for the part of Finance Innovation Division. Thanks a lot.
Great. Well, thank you for that really kind and generous introduction. And it's wonderful to join you today to talk a bit about developments in data and analytics as they relate to sustainability, in particular the role of geospatial data and analysis in this really profound challenge that we have of measuring different risks, but also measuring different externalities, both positive and negative, to manage risk at a microprudential level, but also across the system as a whole, as well as to understand in more detail the contribution that different financial institutions are making to solving some of these big problems, whether that is related to climate change, but also it could be any other thing, including nature, biodiversity, and a whole host of issues that you guys are starting to think about. So what I'm going to do quickly is just tell you a bit about how I think geospatial approaches are really helpful for these things. I'll give you some examples, and then I'm going to tell you a bit about work we're doing to create consistent asset level data sets for different sectors of the global economy, and how that can then support the aims and objectives of greening the global financial system. The first thing to say is that I'm speaking as one of the founders of something called the Spatial Finance Initiative, which was set up a couple of years ago to try and really mainstream spatial finance in financial theory and practice in different ways, working with industry, but also working with the owners and operators of satellites and that whole data value chain, who actually don't do an awful lot with financial institutions. They do some things and have historically done some things that are relatively niche, but what we're trying to do is kind of mainstream the use of these capabilities across the global financial system. I'm very happy also to stop for questions, so please do stop me if you want to ask any questions or if there are any points of information, and you'll be getting the slides as a PDF afterwards as well. And Jose, I'm having trouble seeing the chat and everything, so if you want to just you know, shout. If anyone wants to ask a question, just unmute yourself and shout. And if I can't see you putting up your hand or anything, apologies. Okay, so And the first thing to say, this is very simplistic, but in general is right, which is that we're using approaches at the moment. A lot of institutions are using approaches at the moment that aren't very robust, to say the least. And this is an example of this. So you've got a company A, and that company is exposed to a whole range of different risks. And there are a range of different physical climate-related risks, from tropical storms through to heat waves and water stress, you name it. You've also got a whole range of transition-related risks that include policy and regulation. They include technological change, and a whole bunch of other things, litigation as well, of course. Now, that's a pretty complex risk landscape. There are these correlations between these different types of risk. There's connections between them. They happen over different time horizons. Exposure varies enormously by where a company is located and where its assets are located. But what a lot of people have done to try and distill this complexity into something is to go, okay, well, let's look at carbon intensity, and use that as a proxy for a whole range of things. And there are a variety of carbon intensity type metrics that are used and encouraged, including actually in things like the TCFD. And in general, these are pretty inadequate. So the first thing is, even if you thought it was an accurate metric, it doesn't tell you a huge amount about the nuanced risk exposure of a particular company, let alone a portfolio, and how that might change over time. The reality also is that the data itself is just not very good. And a lot of companies don't disclose. Even if they do disclose, they are disclosing things badly. If you speak to any practitioners who use, for example, carbon disclosure data, there'll be zeros added, zeros missing, people getting their scopes confused. And as soon as you start rummaging, you find out that actually it's not the data itself that's actually reported is not very good. It's also inherently out of date. You're looking at data that's been disclosed, and by the time you get it, it's probably a couple of years out of date. It's also a lot of the data points that exist in these methodologies are based on estimation. They're imputed using black boxes, because a lot of companies don't report. So we need a better approach to this. And I'm not saying that carbon intensity metrics aren't helpful for some things. Some simple heat mapping maybe. I mean, there's some other use cases, but it's not the answer to all of these problems. Looking at the carbon intensity at the parent company level of an entity is just it can only do so many things, right? So what is better? What should we be aspiring to? And the answer is, you got the same company A, and the company has a bunch of different assets. And some of those assets are physical assets. We're particularly interested in physical assets here, but the approach I'm outlining can also apply to intangibles as well. And each of those individual assets is exposed to the same risks I just mentioned. And what we want to do, very simply and intuitively, is we want to measure the exposure of each asset to these risks. We want to put each asset into an analytical time machine, essentially stress test the asset, and then aggregate all those results up to give you a bottom-up picture of the exposures that an asset has, and then aggregate that to the company, and then aggregate that to the portfolio, whether that's an investor portfolio or a bank loan book. And what we want to do is we want to measure things precisely and specifically. We don't want to be, talking about these very high-level metrics that are founded on not very good data. We want to be going, okay, we're interested in physical climate risk. Well, we should be measuring different aspects of physical climate risk over different time horizons, and we should be using appropriate data sets to do so. There's another conversation about the state of physical risk measurement at the moment, but we can come to that if there's time. And then, okay, if you want to measure disruption from clean technology, there are different ways you can do that, particularly in markets, and so on and so forth. This framework, this bottom-up framework, is also relevant for externalities. So at an asset level, you can measure, okay, well, what is asset one's contribution to local environmental pollution? I don't know, if it's a power station. A lot of the assets I'm going to talk about now are obviously, significant assets in terms of pollution. They're point source emitters. They contribute to a large part of the problem. So power companies, power stations, iron and steel facilities, cement facilities, for example, all of these create a lot of global pollution through CO2, but also localized pollution. And so you can measure those contributions at an asset level and then aggregate that up and get a better sense of the contributions that are currently being made, but also estimate how at an asset level that might change in the future, and then aggregate that up. So this is where we need to go in general, and it essentially means that we start with we need the data on where the assets are. Where are the assets? Who owns them? What are their characteristics? And then you move from that to this. Okay, let's measure exposures. Let's put them in this analytical time machine, stress test them, see how their contribution to pollution might change. You might want to link those measures and create scenarios. And obviously that's something that a lot of people are thinking about, including, of course, central banks, with various stress tests linked to scenarios being deployed at the moment. And then the fourth bit here is, you also want to understand how companies are managing these risks and opportunities and externalities, and how they're doing that. And I think, in my mind, and I could go on about this for a while, I'll keep it brief, but in my mind, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and disclosure in general is much more useful for dealing with this question, understanding whether management has a plan, than it is actually providing you with the raw data that you need to fundamentally understand the risk exposure of a company. And that's in part because TCFD type disclosure is going, look, you need to think about this issue. The preparer, you need to think about this issue comprehensively. We've set out a framework. This will help you think about this issue comprehensively. And that, all things being equal, will help you manage these risks, these risk exposures. And that is a very positive thing, which is one reason why it's right that the TCFD framework and disclosures of that sort should be mandatory. But it doesn't solve the data problem, because actually the companies doing TCFD disclosures aren't disclosing data really. They're presenting their own analysis. They're presenting the best version of themselves. They're doing it in a way that makes it almost impossible to do accurate comparisons between companies if you're doing that kind of work as an investor. But what it does do is go, okay, well, we've looked at one TCFD report and another TCFD report from another company, and company A has a better TCFD report than company B, and they have the same fundamental risk exposure based on the analysis we've done, and all things being equal, therefore company A has a plan, seems to have a better plan, that's going to be a less risky company. And then you take all of these inputs, you're doing this fundamental analysis, ideally at an asset level. You're looking at the management and whether the management has a plan, and how capable the management is for executing that plan. And then that's going to affect your credit risk model, your valuation model. So it's I think helpful to think about how these things fit together and what can do what. There isn't really a kind of a single thing that will allow us to do everything. And so that's often what I say to people, on the TCFD. It's that's one thing. It can help with a couple of areas, but if you think this is going to enable you to do transparency in the financial system on climate risk, you're unfortunately mistaken. But we can talk about that more. So just some these are very crude examples of geospatial, just this approach bottom up, using some asset level data sets that we've just spewed out from an internal tool that we have. Just to give you a sense of what's possible. These are slightly out of date. I should have updated them, but again, this is sort of illustrative. So, here's an example. This is power, this is local air pollution. So the hypothesis, here, if you're thinking about risk, is, power stations, fossil fuel power stations in places with lots of air pollution are probably going to be more at risk of regulatory pressure to either be retrofitted or to close down because of higher levels of air pollution locally. So let's find out where power stations are and how close they are to areas with lots of air pollution. And also, we also think that, if they're located next to big population centers, there might also be more pressure for them to shutter or to be retrofitted, and that's expensive and could create stranded assets. These sets of hypotheses are probably more interesting in a jurisdiction South or East Asia than in Europe. So, again, that can be done very simply, but I don't have that slide here. And you can see here, this is sort of a heat map of, okay, well, where are the assets that have in areas that have lots of air pollution as well as being close to air pollution. This gives you, moving on to physical risk, this is acute drought risk under business as usual. So, we aren't tackling climate change as quickly as we should. And you can see there's a lot more acute drought risk in the Mediterranean, as you would expect. And this is if we achieve 1.5 degrees, that's significantly less, you can see. Now, the interesting thing about this data set is it starts to show you some of the challenges that we have with climate models and doing temperature assessment. Actually, you can see that it's a very coarse data set, right? The squares are very large, covering very large areas. And so, if you want a kind of a rough and ready assessment of acute drought risk across, the entire planet, looking at all the power stations on the planet, we can do that now very quickly. But that gives you an approximation of exposure in terms of sort of detailed risk assessment. Obviously, you need to have much more granular data sets, and so there are questions there about which countries have those really granular data sets and projections that go forward, which ones are more accurate than others, which one should we use for different types of analytical use case. So these are all things we're thinking through in different contexts. But this just gives you a sense of some of the stuff we can do. I mean, this is, a lot of people have talked about carbon capture and storage being some sort of panacea for decarbonizing the power sector. This is just an illustrative example of, okay, well, let's take all the fossil power stations in Europe. You're not going to retrofit a gas or a coal-fired power station if it's old. You're probably not going to retrofit it if it's small, and you're probably not going to retrofit it if it's really far away from viable geological storage for carbon. And you apply those filters, and you end up with a very small number of areas that are actually likely to be plausible for carbon capture and storage in Europe. This is kind of interesting because we can apply this to like the US, and so you can see, okay, well, we know which companies own all these assets, and so in this case, if a Spanish utility was to say, oh yeah, we can do CCS because because we can, because CCS is something that's going to happen. This just allows you to do a quick sense check. Really, can you? Doesn't seem to be many characteristics that would suggest you could do it effectively in Spain for a bunch of reasons. Now, that might then result in more specific analysis to test that. But you see this also in the US companies. We've done a bit of analysis of this, in their report saying, yeah, we can do CCS for their power assets, and then you do an analysis like this, and you see that actually there's just no way that that's possible given where the assets are located. This is chronic heat stress. This is business as usual. Again, so heat stress affects the performance of power stations. That makes them less efficient. It's also related to water. And you can see this is 1.5 degrees. So significant changes in risk. And then this is also looking at proximity to protected areas, and there are other measures of figuring out contributions to biodiversity loss that are much more sophisticated than this. But this just gives you an example of the potential of geospatial to help answer some questions. And so that sort of led us to, we started working on this, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, maybe even 7 years ago now. And the thing that's really, one of the things that's really changed over the period that we've been working on it is just the sheer exponential increase in the availability of data and processing power. So this is kind of the heart of what we're trying to do with the Spatial Finance Initiative. And you can see here, this is, it needs to be updated actually. This is a slightly out of date slide, but the number of satellites launched rising very, very rapidly. You've got basically now constellations of CubeSats orbiting planet Earth, taking high resolution pictures of every point on the landmass of the planet every single day in a variety of different spectral bands. You've got obviously investments from the public sector, from ESA, from NASA, that are taking high resolution imagery and making that available for free. Many of these new constellations are commercial, but basically just huge amounts of data being collected every day, creating potentially a searchable back catalog of how the planet is changing. And one of the firms actually that's sort of most prominent and interesting in the space is called Planet Labs, and they're just last week they just announced they're going to go public, which is kind of interesting. So you've got all that image capture, but how do you process it? And so the thing that you do is you use artificial intelligence, you use machine learning, you train algorithms to answer some of these questions. Find assets with these characteristics, and this is what we've been doing with work that I'll tell you more about in a second. Training algorithms to identify assets and their characteristics to speed up the processing of information, and also to speed up the identification of change, because it's physically impossible for a team of people to scan all that information themselves and provide meaningful insight. You need to train computers to do this instead. So I've talked a bit about this already, but we feel very strongly that a critical enabler of spatial finance, this integration of geospatial data and analysis into financial theory and practice, you need these asset level data sets. You need to know where the assets are and their characteristics. And that doesn't exist comprehensively for all the different sectors of the global economy. It exists in some, but not in all. So we have, through a variety of initiatives, pretty good understanding of power assets, particularly utility scale assets. One of my PhD students has just finished his PhD, has been working on identifying solar PV, so around the world using a machine learning algorithm. So he's trained the computer to find out where all the solar panels are, and you can then ask the computer, how many new solar panels have been installed in Africa in the last 3 weeks or something, and you can then get an approximation of an answer. The problem with that type of decentralized power is that it's very hard to figure out who owns the assets. So that kind of makes that's quite a challenging task. With the bigger assets, it's easier to figure out who owns them and then link that back to financial markets. And you can see here, this is sort of this chart showing levels of greenhouse gas emissions and the availability of asset level data. So, power, big contributor to climate. We've got good availability. This is patchy in some places, but generally okay. For iron and steel and cement, we have had very patchy data. That's about to change with the publication of data sets we have created using these methods. And if you're interested in learning much more about all of that, we actually have an event on the 15th of July, which I can share details of with you. And you can see chemicals, petrochemicals, pulp and paper, industrial agriculture, waste management, a heavy industry in general. You know, a lot of these things we have patchy data, and it's also but so there's a quality question, like how good is the data, and how comprehensive is it? But there's also an access question. So some of these data sets there are some data sets that exist. They're sort of patchy. They're often commercial. And so if you're a user, particularly a financial institution, you know, to get a consistent picture to get asset level data for most of the key sectors of the global economy, you know, so that wouldn't be possible today anyway. But for some sectors, what you'd have to do is you'd have to buy several different databases with contrasting identifiers and, you know, inconsistencies in how they estimate things, and it's all a complete mess. So one of the things what we're trying to do through the Spatial Finance Initiative, through a project within that called GeoAsset, is to systematically create these public asset level data sets that are consistent, that are comprehensive, that have used the right identifiers, that have addressed all of those problems so that they're very usable from financial institutions. So we're doing this. I've mentioned already that we've been working on this for power. We've been doing this now with cement and iron and steel. We will be announcing other work as part of this project soon. So just a quick teaser on cement and iron and steel, and then I'll start to wrap up so we've got time for questions. Is you know, this is the sort of work that's being done. You know, let's identify an asset and then train the algorithm, and using different forms of satellite imagery. We've actually had very good results with publicly available satellite imagery, although we've been also doing a bit of training with commercial data. And OpenStreetMaps is also helpful for doing this. And then there's also a role here for natural language processing in terms of identifying owners and also identifying how ownership is changing using textual analysis. So that's kind of complementary to this. And I'm just showing you a bunch of pictures now. I think I've got a colleague on the call who can also talk to some of this in a bit more detail. This is cement. And we go through the process of getting the asset level information using satellite imagery, verifying it manually. There's a lot of manual work as well as funky machine learning. And then that allows us to start doing some analysis. And we can start comparing companies and looking at geographical differences. So, you know, these are kind of most emitting countries for iron and steel production based on these asset level data sets. And then we can look at the companies. You can start comparing the companies, and then you can start asking questions about which companies have portfolios of steel assets that are more likely to be convertible so that they can be net zero aligned. Which ones don't? Which ones are more exposed to different forms of physical climate risk? Let's estimate the carbon lock-in of the different assets that they have based on their size and capacity and age, and compare them. And so this then opens up a whole range of different types of analysis once you've got these asset level data sets. And I'm not going to go through all of this. Is a particular type of analysis around compatibility, but I'm going to skip past this quickly. And you can see we've done some analysis about, you know, least aligned steel producers that we'll be publishing in due course. But I guess the other key point here is that, you know, we're coming at this from, look, we want to start with the most polluting sectors. Fortunately, a lot of the most polluting sectors don't have a huge number of assets. And we're going to make these asset level data sets available so people can do analysis with them. But there are a whole bunch of use cases that aren't environmental. Now, this slide is about use cases across the financial system. But I would just say, you know, if you can see what companies are doing without them disclosing, and you can do that both in real time if you really need to, but, you know, even just doing it once a year will be sufficient for institutional investors and long only equity investors, for example. That's very exciting for financial analysis, because financial analysis at the moment isn't about, there is no geospatial really. Company accounts are not about geospatial, and yet geospatial considerations, the location of where things are, is incredibly important for the risks that exist, but also for the the externalities and the regulatory responses and so on and so forth. So I think this is very exciting, and very interested in exploring the possible regulatory use cases, which I think there's a whole bucket of them in relation to supervision and microprudential work that you'll be doing. I think there's also a lot of this potentially in relation to conduct, and seeing the externalities, positive and negative, that portfolios are actually having, and whether that's aligned with or chimes with, resonates with the claims that institutions are making. So there's a greenwashing use case here as well. Anyway, I will stop there, but thank you for listening, and hopefully I can try to answer some of your questions.
Many thanks, Ben. Really a very interesting and very opening presentation with a lot of implication. I will take the privilege of being the moderator and begin by a question. And I think that we have several questions also from the audience. As I mentioned, you can put either on the chat, or if you raise your hand, we will give you the voice in order to ask Ben directly. My first question is just one, in some sense, methodological question. That is, in some sense, as you mentioned, the TSFD is like some standard for the quality approach or quality risk, what the companies are doing in order to avoid or to manage the climate risk. And where we have really a great challenge is in order to understand the quantitative data. And as you mentioned, there are slow movement from the companies, from the regulator, in order to try to understand, to standardize this information. My question is, to what extent this kind of information from the space that you are dealing and managing and trying to be public for everyone could be like the first standard data that we can use, for example, for the stress test, in order to understand several scenarios, understand what could be the implication for several sectors, and also as a way to promote and to avoid greenwashing from other initiatives from the companies. That is, to be simple, the question is, okay, this kind of do you see some sense, to use this kind of information to implement, for example, the stress test from the regulators? And second, do you see this kind of information as a good incentive in order to avoid greenwashing from the availability of information provided by the companies?
Yeah, great question. And I do think it is. I think central to the stress tests working well is the supervised firms having as much information as possible about the counterparties, and this helps to provide that. Now, it doesn't do that for every sector of the global economy at the moment. We can't do that. I think in the next decade we can get there. If not sooner, actually, if we work, in a coordinated way. So at the moment, you're going to have some sectors where there's going to be asset level data that's useful. Those are going to be in sectors that are very high, high impact from a climate perspective, and therefore quite exposed to particularly transition risks. But also, a lot of these industrial processes do get affected by changing temperatures and water availability, and so the physical risk stuff is also very important. So I think for those high risk sectors, this can be really helpful. But what we'll see for some time is, clearly for some sectors where you don't have the data, you're going to have to use cruder approaches for measuring risk. And for sectors where we have better data, we should be going and doing this from an asset level. And then in terms of incentives to be transparent and honest in the system, I mean, I think disclosure requirements are very high, right? I mean, the burden on disclosure. I mean, the European Commission's own impact analysis, cost-benefit analysis of SFDR, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was something like 3 billion euros a year or something, compliance costs for companies. So it's very high. So you know, I think there's also, and as I discussed, it doesn't actually provide you with the data you need to do the sorts of analysis that you might think would be possible with disclosed information. So there's this massive disconnect between what we're asking companies to disclose, what's actually useful for analysis. So how do we close that gap? I don't think the gap is going to be closed by asking for more disclosures. I think partly because of the compliance burden. I think the the key thing is to invest in some of these capabilities and pre-populate things for preparers. You know, we can hear all your assets. This has been brought together through a combination of satellite imagery as well as other regulatory disclosures that you might have had to make. You know, is this correct or not? And then, you know, that just makes it much simpler. We have argued for a principle of asset level disclosure, which is essentially that, you know, for key sectors, companies should have to disclose what all their assets are and some of their salient characteristics for climate risk analysis. That might help, but still not all companies have to disclose because of different reporting requirements in different jurisdictions. But that would help. You'd be surprised at how we don't know where assets are. You know, banks don't know where these assets are. I mean, there's no geolocation really in most commercial loan book in commercial loan books. So yeah. So anyway, so I think it can definitely create incentives to be honest. It can help reduce compliance costs, and obviously it can create. You know, I've characterized it as sort of ultra transparency. You know, if you can see what companies are doing in near real time, almost, in some cases, you know, that engagement doesn't become a annual cycle. For example, investor engagement and stewardship doesn't become an annual cycle. It becomes a much more proactive activity. So hang on, you've just done this. We can see that you've just done this. And then the other thing on litigation risk, which I know central banks have been very interested in, and there's also something we work on at Oxford, is, you know, this back catalogue is, you know, potentially is going to create a legacy of litigation action, right? Because you can see what companies have been doing already going back 10 years, right? What will happen is that lawyers will go out there with activists and go through this imagery and find all sorts of nefarious activity that's been going on, and bring forward court cases, and many years after the fact, if that's possible, you know, and some obviously statute of limitations and so on. But that's going to be very interesting as well.
I understand that one of the advantages of that is that it's not controversial from the perspective of several countries. That is, here there is no possibility of accounting creativity or something like that. Then it's easier to agree on this kind of data from several governments or several courts or whatever. Then this is more uncontroversial in this sense. Then it's a clear advantage. But let me open the floor to more people. I think that I have on interventions Andrés, Gabriel Bizama, and Ricardo Jimeno. I don't know, Mati, we can open.
Okay. Hello. I would ask them to raise their hand.
Okay.
So we can see them, or if, well, I've sent you the Gabriel Bizama question if he doesn't want to do it.
Okay, yeah. Andrés already raised the hand. Maybe Andrés, can you ask the question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And very interesting the presentation, because it's absolutely brand new information for us who are doing a little bit of research.
Sorry, Andrés, can you turn your camera on, please?
Yes, of course. Hi. So I'm wondering first, because you talked about an asset level database, and when we talk about data, all who do a little bit of research are always willing to get our hands on it. So first question is, how different is this from, for example, PACTA, other methodologies that are already promoting or using this asset level data that so many financial institutions are having? Because listening to you, I also a little bit worry, as José Manuel and yourself, is there maybe an environmental materiality gap regarding the information that we are using with the current tools that we have, and the really good one that you see that is possible to have in the near future. So I was wondering first how different is, and second, now having the hat of the supervisor, who do you think should this information be used by? I mean, should we impose this to the financial institutions to themselves assess their loans with their counterparties, or it's maybe more something for the assurance quality role of the supervisors or the auditors that should, in a second step, get an impression of the quality of the information provided? I mean, how far can we go to impose this very high quality data since the very beginning? So far, this is it. Thank you.
Yeah, great set of questions, which I'll try and answer. So PACTA, we work very closely with 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, and in fact, the kind of the asset level data sets in PACTA come from an EC funded project that we all were also involved with, and we led the package of work on the asset level data sets. So those asset level data sets are essentially, as I understand it now with PACTA, they come from a couple of commercial data providers. Now, what we're doing with our essentially public goods initiative is we're identifying problems in these data sets, or plugging gaps, or providing a better version of the data sets. So we're basically just doing this work to make that available. And of course, the commercial providers can then use that data. We don't mind. We're agnostic about who uses it for commercial means or other objectives. The challenge we're trying to fix is we need, one, these data sets don't exist. So in some cases, they just don't exist, right? So we've got to create them. And in other cases, they do exist, but they're patchy and they're commercial. So how can we make sure they're suitably comprehensive? And we think they should be free. We think that, the commercial entities should be competing to create better analytics using data sets rather than trying to, I've got my cement data set. I'm gonna sweat that asset and sell it to the highest bidder. Just makes it really hard. It just makes it much harder for end users to start developing these bottom-up approaches. So PACTA is one example of something that's using asset level data sets. Hopefully PACTA will become better as a result of better asset level data sets and new asset level data sets that are becoming available. In terms of the use cases, I think the cool thing about this is there's so many use cases. So you literally can use it, for a whole bunch of things. From the assurance things that you used, absolutely, through to any number of things. From a policymaker perspective, this gives you actual insight into whether companies are likely to be able to transition. Gives you insight into how you manage the just transition as well. So another angle here is, okay, well, which communities are dependent on which assets, and if they have to close, who loses their jobs, and how does that fit in with interventions that a government could make, and what's the role of the central bank in that potentially, depending on mandates. So yeah, everything from holding institutions to account for whether they're meeting their promises, through to public policy, through to seeing where the pockets of risk are. So yeah, it's going to be very exciting. But also, it's not just about the environment. I think this is going to be useful for all sorts of finance. Anything to do with financial analysis. If you start adding this sort of data, these sorts of capabilities, it becomes very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. I have also Gabriel Bizama. Gabriel, can you unmute?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the interesting presentation, Ben, and the same, Jose. Thank you for the chance to asking questions. So, Ben, you were
Sorry, Gabriel. Can you please say which organization you belong to?
Yes, of course. I'm international policy lead at Stellar Development Foundation. So actually, my question was, Ben, you were referring to artificial intelligence and other technology that could help reducing costs. So my question is, what were your views in terms of using blockchain technology in order to, again, reduce costs and also reduce information asymmetries?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think that the areas that I'm most excited about in relation to distributed ledgers and so on is really around smart contracts, and providing transparency and security for those contracts. And this becomes very interesting if we're thinking about, for example, how do we pay for somebody in, pick a country, Brazil or Indonesia or the Congo? How do we pay those people to protect their rainforests? And at the moment, all of that structured around not very smart contracts at all. It's structured around, government to government things, and the reality is on the ground in these countries, people have mobile banking, and so how do you create a smart contract? And you can monitor what's going on the ground using satellites. So I could make a donation, a government could make a donation, and we could then see which block of forest we paid for yesterday, and if it's still there tomorrow, they'll get another payment. And that can all be transparently stored, securely stored on a distributed ledger. So those sorts of I think those are all very, very promising, because a large part of this, remember, is about how do we get capital to flow into solutions to these big environmental problems, but we've got to do it efficiently. And the cost and efficiency helps to reduce the cost of capital, and that's important for these projects to be economic, and it's important for that to reduce the overall cost of the transition. So I think it's a really exciting area. Another thing that we're also interested in doing more work in.
Thanks, Ben. I have one question from Ricardo Jimeno, that is the head of financial market intelligence from Banco de España. Unfortunately, he cannot speak because he's in the mobile, but I will read his question. It's related with one of the charts that you present. You present some projection on risks of droughts in regions in Europe, depending on the increase of temperature. Obviously, as this is very important from our perspective. Ricardo asked, how do you construct them? I mean, how do you know that an increase in temperature is going to produce a desertification and not a tropical forest?
Yeah, good question. So I'm not a climate scientist, but I work very closely with climate scientists, so I can pass that question on. But I think, and my understanding of it is at a regional and obviously at a global scale, these processes are well understood, and yeah, I mean, it's so well understood that it's really very depressing, actually. What's already in the pipeline in terms of physical impacts that we're all going to suffer from, and of course we're seeing this already in a variety of jurisdictions all the time, but particularly just like in North America at the moment with heat waves. So yeah, but there's a really big set of questions around how you downscale global climate models in a way that's going to be appropriate for the stress testing that you're doing, and also for individual financial institutions. And there's an awful lot of when I speak to climate scientists about this, including in this new center that you kindly introduced, Jose, it's they're shocked at how climate models are being used to give definitive answers to things where they're just not designed to do that. They just can't give the change in physical climate risk for a specific location between 2030 and 2040. They actually aren't designed to do that, and yet those are the sorts of products in the market that are being sold. So there's a lot of false security being marketed by some of the data providers on physical risk quality and its ability to be genuinely predictive.
So you mean that the uncertainty on these models and on this information provided is not properly reflected? That is, given that we do not have this global view, but will be the climate change by regions.
Yeah.
So it means more involvement or more working with the physics in order to try to understand the impact for the financial sector.
Well, yeah, but it's also we have this terrible tendency to overcomplicate things so much on every, probably the first thing we should be doing to understand our physical climate risk exposure is understanding what our physical climate risk exposure is today. So if you're in an area where you've got assets that have been affected by drought, that's probably going to get worse. So let's start there.
Yeah.
And similarly with transition risk, I spend so much time reviewing or talking to people about portfolio alignment, implied temperature rise metrics, incredibly complicated, so many assumptions. You can cook up any answer basically from these things. That they have some use, unquestionably. They can be useful as part of the process, but it's pretty simple with fossil fuels. We just don't invest in new ones, and you got to don't refinance existing ones. It's really not that. It's not rocket science, and yet we have made it more complicated than rocket science.
Yeah, that's true. We will not take you more of your time. That I know you are a very busy person, but I would like to make a final question, if I can. As I mentioned, we are working with this BIS Innovation Network on several areas related with green finance. And one of the areas where we are working is in order to try to understand what could be the best initiatives in order to improve the impact materiality of the shocks and to validate the information. Then, from your perspective, not only from the space but for other uses of the technology for financial system, what could be the base areas where we can work in order to spread the knowledge to other central banks?
Well, great question. I probably don't have a very good answer to it. I know you guys are collaborating very well, it seems like, through the NGFS and through other fora. Yeah. I think there is a data work stream. I think in the NGFS we're having initial conversations about how our work can support that. And very keen to do so. What's the off-the-shelf data that can be used by everyone? I think technical assistance, particularly in emerging developing economies, is really important. Very glad to see the new Central Bank Training Alliance announced last week. I think there was a press release last week, or maybe it's coming out tomorrow. I can't remember. But those sorts of initiatives are important. I think in addition to the work I know that Alliance will be doing through the BIS and that training platform, the name of which I've forgotten. At Oxford, we're very keen to support capacity building, training, in a kind of, in a broader sense, introductory courses, other more specific courses, exploring new issues like this one. So we've just for your reference, we've just set up a new public and third sector academy for sustainable finance, and we've just got a good chunk of funding from philanthropy. So we're very keen to work with central banks around the world to support that new alliance, to support you. So anything on the technical assistance, training, capacity building side of things, do let us know. And I think there's probably also, of course, making sure that content is available in the Spanish-speaking world readily. Yeah. So that's also something we could collaborate on potentially.
Okay, thanks a lot then for your time. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I understand that we can start the presentation with the audience if you want to allow us.
Yep.
And thanks for your time, and I hope that we can collaborate in the future and be in contact. Thanks to everyone that attend to this webinar. We record the webinar in order to see later if you allow us to the rest of the people that cannot connect today. And just all my best in this effort in order to build and to have public data available to everyone, and to improve the use of trust data and good data in order to promote a good finance for the society. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thanks, guys. Stay in touch. Bye.
See you. Bye.